Philippe Bédard, I think we met in 2016 or something, while we were both working on projects about GoPro camera. And Philippe was publishing also text in a book I edited together with Winfried Görling on the GoPro camera, and I just mentioned it because this text fits so well to the presentation that Daniel gave us yesterday. The title of his text is Going Beyond the Human Perspective, GoPro Cameras and the Non-Anthropocentric Ways of Seeing. And I'm very happy that our research interests crossed again after that project, and we met on various occasions on working on interactive documentary. And just before I give you the floor, I want to mention three works he's published. One is forthcoming book with the title Making Room for, wrong.
That's the chapter in the book.
That's the chapter in the book, but the title of the book is States of Immersion, Bodies, Media, Technology. And the two texts I want to mention are Making Room for Empathy in Contemporary Virtual Reality Cinema and Closing the Gap, Storytelling in Non-Fiction Virtual Reality. Philippe, thank you very much for being here.
Thanks, Fabian. Thank you so much. And yeah, despite there being non-fiction in the title of that very latest article, I don't typically consider myself a scholar of documentary or non-fiction. It just so happens that a lot of VR is non-fiction, especially when dealing with empathy. So it just so happens that, yes, I've been writing about non-fiction VR, even though that's not my original expertise. And I wouldn't consider myself either a historian or a scholar of interactive documentary, but I think there's some really interesting overlaps with VR and interactive documentary. So the idea for this presentation came from a discussion with Florian in Montreal last year, where you mentioned a interactive documentary with near infinite, I'm paraphrasing here, but the infinite possibilities of going through the story and the fact that you could potentially not encounter every possible story there was to have. And so that brought to my mind this idea or challenge in interactive media, or what Espen Afsted would call ergodic media, this media that requires a certain non-trivial challenge for you to advance in a story, and the very real risk that you could not get to the end or not get every part of the story. Just this larger challenge, this notion of challenge that has been interesting for me, of the fact that you could possibly not get the entire story. And this has been said about VR as well, by filmmakers mostly, this idea that you can't control what the viewer is seeing, and this is perceived as a lack in VR, that you cannot control exactly where the audience will be looking, whereas games and interactive media have been dealing with that challenge for so long. And the last element that I'll be wanting to deal with in this talk, and this relates to the two articles on empathy that Florian mentioned, is this critique that is often brought up of VR being a medium without a frame. So again, this challenge of not being able to control where the audience looks. And also the idea that VR is a very self-centered medium. It is a first-person experience, but some perceive that to be a barrier to telling non-fiction stories, and especially stories that ask you to care about others. Now, I like to argue with these kinds of statements and disprove them, and this is where I'm coming from with this presentation. And the second point I'm coming from with this presentation, and I was just wanting to talk about this project that I worked on with the NFB, but it turns out to be very timely because it is likely the last project out of the NFB Interactive Studios. So I wanted already to take the opportunity of this platform you've given me to talk about this project and the work that I've done with the NFB to document this project, but it'll also be very timely for you to learn about this experience, because I have doubts as to how much it will tour, if at all. So just for a bit of context, I was approached by Louis Richard Tremblay at the interactive studios in Montreal of the National Film Board in March of last year with the project of documenting their ongoing interactive productions, to document what they did right, what they did wrong, their mistakes, their learnings, so that the product of their work would be more than just the interactive project itself, but also all of the learnings. And so that led to a blog article that you can read right now in French and English on the NFA blog, which is now simply titled, How Does Chomsky versus Chomsky Work? And if we have time during the Q&A, I can give you a look at some of the earlier iterations of this text where we essentially tried to go the web doc version, but we didn't have time or the money to create an interactive version of that text, and also people were complaining that there were too many clicks, or that they wanted to read every part of the story, so why hide it behind clicks? So it ended up being a very linear text after all, but we can get into that if you want later. But so in addition to just talking about Chomsky versus Chomsky, the experience itself, I'll use it to address issues in what I perceive to be, or rather I'll say that I will use Chomsky versus Chomsky to kind of argue against some of the criticisms that have been said about nonfiction VR, specifically about empathy, and specifically also an issue of solipsism that I notice about VR being too self-centered. So I'll use Chomsky versus Chomsky as a counterpoint. As an example, I think that disproves these things, or if it does prove them in a way that is not problematic as opposed to other projects. So we've brought up once or twice throughout this conference the issue of VR in the context of nonfiction. We've seen with William that many early media go through this nonfiction phase, and that was the case with VR as well. I'll get back to this early revival of VR. Florian mentioned these texts. I don't want to dwell too much on them. If you want the broader lit review on empathy and VR, these are the two references. I will summarize some of the points and highlight some of the main criticisms that I address in these articles. I think they're behind paywalls, but of course, just email me and I'll gladly send you the PDFs for those. So from the beginning of what I've usually called VR's revival around 2012 or so, VR has been used for much more than games and training applications, for which I think it remains the dominant use of these technologies. It's also been used, as many of you know, for cinematographic purposes, among which documentary. Already in 2012, we see Noni de la Peña, who uses prototype Oculus headsets made by Palmer Luckey, working with her in a lab to create Hunger in LA, a journalistic piece in VR. Very early on, also, we've mentioned on several occasions Clouds over Sidra that Chris Milk produced with Gabo Aurora, and now at the time also 2015 is now infamous TED Talk on the ultimate empathy machine. I often call it the much maligned TED Talk because I think people have jumped on it to make the enemy out of him. There are interesting points in his talk. And at the same time, we see many news outlets also jump on the bandwagon. Here, the displays by the New York Times, BBC, The Guardian also try to make these immersive productions. And I just wanted to include a third example, more recent, that I particularly like, by Joanne Popinska, called The Choice, which deals with abortion rights in the US, which was already timely then, sadly even more timely now. And now, naturally, with these topics based in real world and with real people, these being used to such an extent, it was also the subject of much criticism. I'll bring up a few here, but of course my articles mentioned earlier bring up many more criticisms. One I like to point to is Lisa Nakamura, who speaks of these as forms of toxic empathy. She calls those virtuous VR because they're about making users feel good about feeling bad. I'm such a good person because I cried for what happened to this poor person. and she's very critical of that concept. Similarly, Robert Yang, in a blog article called "If You Walk a Mile in Someone's Shoes, You've Stolen Their Shoes," which is stolen from, well, not stolen, but it's a quote from Wendy Chun, who gave a keynote talk with that title. Robert Yang calls those not an empathy machine, but rather an appropriation machine, criticizing an industry that uses the suffering of people for their own monetary gain, or for what we might call empathy washing, essentially. So I could go on, but I wanted to focus on one or two particular criticisms that I'd like to come back to. One of them is Dirk Aitzen's and his problems and potentials of VR for documentary storytelling, in which he argues, and I might be summarizing a bit too much this point, but one point that I always come back to is this idea of VR being too self-centered to be used effectively to tell stories about other people, as opposed to cinema, which he describes as a third-person experience. Aitzen likens VR to video games, which are about your own experience, and it's very common to narrate or to tell the experience that you've had of a VR project in the first person. I did this, I did that, same as in a game. But what I take issue with this reduction. Now, the point of critique that I often bring up in response to this idea is the very notion of empathy implies going beyond your first-person perspective. We will always be limited to our first-person perspective. Even watching a film, you're in your body, in your first-person perspective, or listening to your best friend telling you a story. You need to step out of your own limited perspective to empathize with someone else. It's empathy 101, I usually say. So why not apply the same logic to VR, even if we do agree, and I am the first person to say that VR is a fundamentally subjective apparatus. This was an article from 2019, which is translated now and will be coming out in the Journal of Cinema and Media Studies in 2024. Fall, if all goes well, called the subjective apparatus. Or I make the point that VR is a fundamentally subjective apparatus, but that doesn't mean that because the mode of experience of VR is in the first person, that the stories that the medium is used to tell also need to be in the first person. We saw examples yesterday of a zero-point perspective, this idea, but there are many more examples. The choice that I showed earlier is a second-person perspective, a conversation where, yes, you are the first-person protagonist, but in a conversation with someone else. So it's not really your story, it's her story being told to you. Another good example is A Machine to Be Another, which was brought up, which is still a first-person experience about putting yourself in someone else's skin, but at least this one is interesting because it involves the mutually agreed upon, it's a contract of we are both agreeing to put ourselves in each other's skin, and you can speak with the person as well. So it's problematic in certain respects, certain iterations of the experience, but less problematic. And I think then Aitzen makes it out to be this egocentric nature of VR can still lead to interesting result. And the other point, Rob brought it up earlier, Kate Nash's notion of improper distance in nonfiction media, and specifically this idea of that VR might foster this improper distance by creating an illusion that viewers are experiencing or witnessing things firsthand through their own first-person perspective, as if they were really there. Now, VR is a very convincing simulative experience, and for Nash, VR runs the risk of producing an improper distance if it gives the user's illusion that they're on location experiencing things from a first-person perspective, if they don't understand, or if the experience is not framed as well, if we want to do away from framing the user as solely responsible, if the designer doesn't design their experience as clearly a mediation of an experience, if they lean too hard into the perceptual immediacy, the transparency of the experience, and making it seem like you are really seeing this firsthand, those are the problematic aspects. And it is very problematic also in 360 VR, where the filmmaker has to go away and hide, so you don't have that unspoken contract between the person holding the camera and filming They're kind of our proxy on scene normally, but with 360 VR, since the filmmaker has to go hide, that kind of, you're alone there without the proxy of the filmmaker on the scene. So I agree with Nasha's criticism, but I still think, and I'll try to show in the rest of this presentation, that there are ways that this ironic mode of moral engagement and self-focus or self-projection might still be used effectively in VR storytelling, even though those cases might be very limited. There are very few exceptions, I think, where this ironic mode is relevant, but I think Chomsky is one of those. So the experience was first shown in Germany in late 2022, October, if I'm not mistaken. Definitely what I remember, the dates are in the article. It was shown before ChatGPT was out to the public, which will become relevant a bit later. It's a piece about AI, dealing with AI, using AI, but it was started much earlier. Perhaps William will be able to correct me on the dates, but 2016, if I'm not mistaken. So it was started much before ChatGPT became a thing, and launched even before ChatGPT launched. And that's not to say that it didn't include ChatGPT later in its production. So it's an experience meant for 4 people. I think you can see here standing around a monolith. People are wearing HTC Vive Pro headsets that have been modified with a hand tracking system and microphones. So the experience uses AI, voice recognition, voice synthesis, hand tracking. It's an extremely complex experience. Users are in front of this styrofoam or whatever monolith, and within the diegesis of the experience, this monolith will be housing Chomsky written with a 5, which will be much harder to say verbally than in writing. So I'll do my best to explain when I'm talking about Chomsky, the AI, and Chomsky, the human on which it was trained. So this conversational agent, as I often describe it, was inspired by and trained on the digital traces left by Noam Chomsky, who is one of the most recorded or documented living intellectuals to date. For example, Chomsky.info is a database where people have been transcribing all of the interviews he's ever given, so that gives a lot of material, written material, to train an AI upon. And so it was around 2016, again, if I recall correctly, that the project's creator, Sandra Rodriguez, who was working at MIT at the time, someone brought up this idea of using machine learning to train a chatbot on all of Chomsky's writing. Would it be possible to reproduce Noam Chomsky's mode of thinking, his personality, by training an AI on all of his traces? Part of the idea, of course, came from an ironic position, because Chomsky's work on language and human intelligence, and also I think he's been pretty against AI and the idea that AI would be able to reproduce human intelligence, so that kind of made him a prime candidate to attempt to reproduce them through AI. I didn't really have a good place to put this slide. I actually had cut it. This is just the timeline that you go through the experience, but since, again, it's possible no one will get to see it again, I just wanted to share this, this slide, which is the timeline for the experience. So you start in a blank room with a monolith, and I'll get to that point in a bit. You encounter Chomsky at first point. You then peek under his answer generation system. You eventually collaborate with other users. He then monologues about what the conclusion you should take away from the experience, and then it ends. And there is also a whole onboarding, offboarding that we can get into, but I didn't have time to include any pictures here. So to get back to the experience and how it got started, the point of departure for the experience itself was the question of the nature of human intelligence and whether AI itself would be capable of reproducing it. And specifically, the thesis statement the experience made surrounding the experience was around the notion of conversation. At least from my discussions with the producers and some of the technicians, that's the idea that came back more and more often. Rather than trying to build a chatbot, which they felt was very transactional, of you can ask me any questions. and then you just ask a question and it spits out an answer. They were trying to build a conversational agent, and specifically a chatbot that can lead to meaningful conversation, whatever we want that to mean. So is a chatbot able to hold a meaningful conversation, or is it a specifically human skill? And more specifically, they wanted to build this conversation about AI, with an AI, and through a AI. So if you end up reading my behind the scenes about the production, you will see that AI is a central theme. Not only was it used during the production, it's also the very modality through which the story unfolds. So AI comes into the picture even before you start the conversation with Chomsky, with 5, Chomsky the AI. The experience starts in a blank room where you see a monolith in front of you with these CAPTCHA-like AI-generated images of bicycles and trucks, and you're asked to prove your humanity by selecting it. And whether you succeed or fail, and I failed a couple times, I must say, sometimes the AI are close but not quite close enough, it seems. You then are moved to a desert-looking area which aims to emulate where Noam Chomsky really lives, where you finally get to meet Chomsky, the conversational agent. The users are invited to ask Chomsky any question they want, and they're encouraged, I would imagine, to ask questions about him, the AI, him, the human, perhaps, about AI itself, about human intelligence, but they can ask him anything. I asked him the best recipe for pasta, and he gave the usual ChatGPT non-committal answer, and that can lead to some interesting. I also asked him what the best cognitive bias was, and he just gave me the same answer as for the pasta. There is no best cognitive bias. You have to try many and find the one that you like. So we'll get to that perhaps a bit later. So how it comes up with this answer and how it comes up with some of these answers, and I've only given so far a joke answer, which really happens, but okay, so this is probably very hard to read. I again encourage you to go on the blog and see the full version. I think you can download a huge PNG file in order to navigate through that, but it's just to showcase the complexity of the system that the NFB and Schnelle Buntebilder had to construct in order for the AI to recognize human language, translate it if need be into English from either French, English, or German. Well, no need to translate English to English. It then recognizes the user's intention, and we'll find examples of that a bit later. So intention, am I asking a question about, is it just chit-chat? Am I asking a question about Chomsky the AI? Am I asking a question about human intelligence? He will detect my intention and then answer in kind. And he'll answer through 3 different ways. I think we can see here in the, the answer. I'll show you here, it'll be a bit clearer. So there are 3 ways in which it'll answer questions. The first is through a phase which Sandra Rodriguez went through of coding by hand, if I understood correctly, up to 6,000 pairs of answers and questions based on extensive research into Chomsky's archives at the MIT. So she, from what I recall from our discussion, read through his materials and came up with questions and answers, as broad a range of questions and the answers as closely as possible to what Chomsky would have answered. But of course this is very labor intensive and is not nearly enough to answer every question. I doubt this would have had an answer to my pasta question. So a second phase of the research consisted in seeing how a generative pre-trained model could be used to train a conversational agent on all the traces in the Chomsky.info database. So this is the work that was done with GPT-2, but before ChatGPT became publicly available. This was done with Move AI in Montreal, and involved a lot of work, specifically to curate the up to 18,000 answers that were generated, many of which were very pointed and about the actual interview in which the Q&A occurred. So it wasn't relevant to the user asking a question. I just wanted to include also examples of the back end. You have many more of these examples on the blog. But whenever you ask a question, they are sent to a Microsoft Azure system, which then is used to identify the intention of the question and select a couple answers based on a confidence score, whether the system feels confident with the accuracy of its answer to your question. And we can see here also that it generates several answers. Sometimes if, for example, it's already answered the same, if you ask the same question twice, it will try to answer something differently. And it will do so in part by making a call at ChatGPT as a kind of last resort. And it does so by also framing a very precise prompt of "you are Chomsky." The prompt is like a page long that it sends every single time with every question, just for you to try to guide the answers that Chomsky will give you to avoid this pasta mistake, but of course these still happen. And I'll give you an example of how it can bring, in the peek under phase of the experience, you are invited to click on all of the words to see all the other options it could have given you. So this is the paradigmatic dimension of language, where it's giving you all the options it could have given you at any point in the sentence. We don't see it here in this example, but an example that happened to me was I asked him what his favorite film was. Chomsky, the AI, answered that as an AI he didn't have a favorite film. He then answered that Noam Chomsky and his wife were once avid moviegoers. But if I click on the word movie, he shows the word comic book with a 0.01% chance of accuracy. So he didn't choose that answer because it was not likely that Noam Chomsky was an avid comic book reader. At least that's what the system analyzed. Let me just pause the video. So I see that time is running out, so I won't go too much into some of the other mess-ups that the app had. I want to talk a little bit about this other interactive part, which here you're no longer interacting with Chomsky the AI, but you're rather interacting with, or collaborating rather, with the other three participants. I have an inkling or a thought that this is related to some of Chomsky's doctoral work on the way children solve problems unprompted, their ability to solve complex problems just by encountering patterns and being able to make connections. The project itself makes claims about AI's inability to do so, and the aim of this particular part is to show how users working together can easily solve that. In actuality, it's not that true. It's extremely hard to do that unless you know how to solve the puzzle and you guide the others to do so. Most people, I think, will flounder and not be able to do it correctly until it will take a lot of time. And we can go into a whole analysis about what this means, but I think it just highlights another way users are invited to interact here with one another, and how the topic of the experience in that moment becomes more than what Chomsky is trying to tell you, and more about AI's ability to recognize patterns or humans' ability to interact with one another and collaborate. The story ends with Chomsky glitching out of existence. He says that he's still under construction, and so he's not able to go on for much longer, at which point he needs to say goodbye. But he leaves us with one final question. Are you truly unique? And so that's the point of the experience, essentially, is the users themselves and whether they think they are unique. I have a note here. I showed Florian earlier that if we've run past 26 minutes, I need to skip this part, which we have, so I will. But I can go into some more mistakes the system has when it recognizes incorrectly your intention, or it's unable to give a faithful answer to your question. So even though I've just highlighted a couple of the shortcomings of this experience, and even though there are more that I could share, I still believe Chomsky versus Chomsky is a extremely interesting experience, if only for what it tells us about the way the National Film Board of Canada makes or made its interactive projects, in addition to what it tells us about VR and its ability to tell nonfiction stories. As far as the interactive studios are concerned, Chomsky embodies its philosophy, which has been published in some of their presentations or on their blog. This is a retelling we did for the blog of what do you have the user feel, what do you have the user think, and what do you have the user do throughout the experience. So that's a guiding principle in all of their interactive experiences, and I think it brings us back to this solipsistic idea of VR. It's not a problem if that's the point of the experience of making the user reflect on what they're feeling, making the user reflect on what they're thinking or what they're doing. I was pausing here to let people take a photo. I'll just conclude again with this solipsistic idea that Einstein criticizes about VR, about VR being about our own experience more than about the experience of others. And I want to argue that it doesn't have to be a problem. If you design an experience to be about the user's own reflections or own thoughts, then it doesn't need to be a problem. And I have some more concluding points, but I think I'll just end with that and leave it for the Q&A. And I have some more parts if we want to go there eventually about like some of the earlier versions of the blog post, which I try and, if we're going to do linear, maybe let's do it as a conversation. Maybe we ask Q&A and we ask people to choose the right answer and select their own path through the article, which didn't work out in the end, but we can go through that if you're curious. But thank you for your attention.